It's a rainy old day here at the moment, so it's a good time to sit down and record a video just in the lead up to the 28th of April when I'll go live, and we'll talk about the Port Arthur Massacre. We'll discuss some of the conspiracy theories that abound, because it really is a petri dish for all sorts of conspiracy bacteria that flourish in the conditions created by, the mishandling of the event by police and the media storm, the trauma responses of people that were there. So I thought, in preparation, let's just go through a quick run through of Martin Bryant's life, just some of the events that shaped him, I guess, and that'll cut down on discussion time on the 28th. So Port Arthur Massacre. Port Arthur is a place in Tasmania. It was a penal colony, and it's east of Hobart, on just down on that southeast part of the little island that's off the continent of Australia. So it's part of Australia. It's called Tasmania. It's one of our states. And on its eastern side, down the bottom, on the southern end, there's sort of a series of islands that are just offshore, and some little isthmuses that are, connected to the mainland, but by a very narrow piece of land. So they're nearly islands, probably eventually they would be, right? And on the main one of those, southeast of Port of Hobart, is where Port Arthur is, and it was in that location because it was decided that this was a really good place to have, a penal colony. It's really hard to escape from, right? Because there's just one little narrow way in and way out. So I guess in the same way that Alcatraz is an island off the coast of San Francisco, it was a good idea to put Port Arthur Penal Colony out on this little peninsula in this sort of isolated area. And Martin Bryant is the person who is in jail for the crimes that were committed there in 1996. It was a massacre occurred over 2 days, 28th and 29th of April. 35 people were murdered, 23 were injured. There were 2 counts of arson that he was convicted for, 3 counts of grievous bodily harm, and 8 of inflicting wounds. So Martin Bryant, he was born in Hobart in a place called Lenna Valley on the 7th of May 1967. His parents were Morris and Carleen, and they were married in 1965. A few years after Martin was born, they had a daughter they named Lindy, and Lindy really wants her anonymity. She's changed her name. She's tried to hide her identity. She spoke once to media a few years ago, and she was making statements, but then didn't want to do a formal interview sort of thing. So to her surprise, but it shouldn't have been really, I guess to her chagrin though, her statements were published, and you can look those up online. But she does not go to visit Martin, and she doesn't want anything to do with him. So the family also had a shack at Carnarvon Bay, which is where Port Arthur is, on the coast. Port Arthur, right? And it was adjacent to the Port Arthur site, and it was this is a place that Martin grew up in all his life. He had a very difficult relationship with his mother practically from birth. As a baby, as a toddler, as a young child, he didn't want to be held by Carleen, and he would often just run away as well. He would be found everywhere, all around the neighbourhood, and this led to Carleen, in her desperation, tying him up in a harness and then securing him to the veranda of their home, so that he could hang out and play with his toys and she could get on with things like housework, etc., and not worry about his safety. Neighbours really were quite perturbed with this. They obviously thought it was quite strange, didn't know if he was being abused or not, right? But look, little boys can be like this. I was just talking about this with someone this morning who has a toddler, and he's running into things all the time. And my little brother, he never walked anywhere. As soon as he was upright, he ran, and he used to run into things. We'd worry about him running onto the road, and so we used a harness on a leash, you know, like his little pet. But it's really just trying to consider the safety of this little baby, right? Yeah, so Martin, he didn't like physical touch, and you know, you do have to consider attachment disorders and things like that. I know everything in hindsight, right? And Carleen wasn't to know what was to come of her little boy, but I do wonder, I think Maurice always knew. Maurice worked his ass off trying to keep Martin occupied and on the straight and narrow. In 1977, so he was 10, he was suspended from his primary school. That's not booted out permanently, but just suspended for alleged animal torture, and he was bullying other children. He would really make a nuisance of himself, and he seems to, throughout his life, always revel nearly in making people uncomfortable. And yet he was very upset that he would repel people and that they would just walk away from him. He was very jealous of his younger sister Lindy because she made friends easily, and she was personable and she was bright. In 1979, 12-year-old Martin was in hospital for a week following a firework incident, and this made it onto a local television news station. He had gotten a firework tangled up in his jeans somehow, and anyway, he burned himself. And, you know, in this famous or infamous little snippet, Martin's being interviewed. The person asks, you know, have you learned your lesson? Would you do it again? Yes, he says, yes, I will do it again. You know, I think that's a foreshadowing of his Asperger's diagnosis, maybe. I know that's not how things are termed these days, but 12 years ago when he eventually got that diagnosis, that's how it was termed. In 1980, he resumed class in high school. He was in a special education class, and I really don't think they did much to try to educate Martin. It wasn't really a priority, and it's been stated, you know, it was all downhill for Martin from then. And at the time, you could leave school legally at 16 years. So on the day before his 16th birthday, Morris withdrew Martin Bryant from school, and that was the end of his education. In 1981, around this time period, Maurice purchased Martin an air rifle, and I've made videos about this, haven't I, in the past. Parents who buy troubled children weapons, whether it's knives, guns. Maurice deeply regretted this. All he wanted to do was introduce another activity to Martin, something to occupy him. And, you know, it became apparent that Martin Bryant, he wasn't capable of a safe gun practice. He enjoyed taking pot shots at passing traffic. When people would stop, for example, at, you know, there's little roadside vegetable stands and things like that, he enjoyed trying to shoot them, and he would brandish the gun in front of his neighbours. And so, of course, they avoided him, and this did deeply upset Martin. They reported that he shot rosellas that were nesting or roosting in a tree, rosella parrots. If they were maimed and fell to the ground, he walked up to them and shot them at point blank range. And those birds never returned to that tree. I mean, that was no longer now a traditional roosting ground for those parrots, who would have been there for generations, for as long as that tree was big enough to hold parrots. Do you know what I mean? Because that's, you know, birds, other animals, they have these cultural lives and traditional lives. There are other reports, you know, there are people in old footage saying that, well, Martin was quiet and they thought he was gentle, or he sort of just kept to himself and didn't bother people. But there's a lot of reports where he really did bother people. He made quite a nuisance of himself. You know, everybody's complicated. In 1983, he was assessed for a disability pension with a dooming prognosis. Quote, only his parents' efforts prevent further deterioration. Could be schizophrenic, and his parents face a bleak future with him. Morris deeply invested himself in Martin's well-being and in being a responsible father. He really did do this, I think, to a really high degree, considering the troubled life that Martin had and what a difficult type of person he was. He took him scuba diving, so he would take Martin out so Martin could go diving, use a spear gun, get rock lobsters. He really tried to keep him, you know, occupied with activity and feeling good in that way that doing physical activity really helps you. Although, you know, when he was being assessed, it was, you know, noted that he really was very lonely and just watched a lot of TV, or stalked around neighborhoods with his gun, that type of thing. Martin, throughout his childhood, yeah, he really kept this up, and so, you know, so regretful that he did buy Martin his first air rifle. And so since 14, Martin has had a weapon. Anywho, he also bought Martin some tools, some gardening tools, hoping that Martin could build up some sort of casual business to supplement his disability pension, and again, keep him connected to the community and keep him occupied. You know, being father to Martin was a full-time job. In 1987, Martin, through that gardening arrangement, he met Helen Mary Elizabeth Harvey, and, you know, he'd noticed how unkempt her gardens were. She had this really, she lived in squalor, basically, in an Art Deco mansion in Newtown, and they developed a friendship. Carlene, his mother, said, you know, they seemed to have an instant connection. They were almost inseparable. So Helen had worked at the Tasmanian Railway until she was 28 years old, but she didn't have to work. She's one of what used to be at the time was one of these mysterious, Tattersalls heiresses. So Tattersalls, it's through her mother's husband's side of the family. That's where the name Harvey came from. Her mother was Hilza Calf Bell, and, you know, her grandfather was a mason. He worked for the Sydney Morning Herald. He was a journalist for, you know, and then eventually worked his way into some sort of press work in Parliament, I think. And Hilza married Lorimer Escott Harvey, who was son of David Hasty Harvey. And David Hasty Harvey had been hired by this guy called George Adams, who Tattersall's was already in existence. This as an organization, as a company, this company Tattersall's. So it's over 250 years old. But George Adams, who's a self-made man, he was an immigrant with his family. He worked really hard. He started off in the gold rush. He's moved around selling real estate and raising money for himself that way. And he became known to business people in Sydney, and 3 of his friends there actually bought the Tattersall's Hotel in Sydney and Pitt Street for him and said, pay us when you can, and eventually obviously paid that off. But he got into the lotteries business, so naming it after the hotel, he started up the sweepstake for a horse race, the Sydney Cup, and it just grew from there. And how he ended up in how Harvey, who George brought on board, how he ended up in Tasmania was Harvey had the idea to, he'd gone down to Tasmania. I think he'd already, because he was moving state to state, because obviously with gambling, laws are always changed because, groups kick back, especially religious groups and things. So at one point he'd moved out of New South Wales and he'd come up to Queensland, and then he'd ended up in Tasmania, and there was the bank there, the Bank of Van Diemen's Land. We have a Dutch history, immigrant history here in Australia and in New Zealand. But the bank was going into liquidation. He had the idea to sell raffles at £1 each, and he wanted to sell 300,000 of them, and they didn't sell that much, but he did it again and again, to save businesses, and people could win public bars, taverns, hotels. They could win businesses and things. So the prizes were quite amazing. And he'd amassed quite a fortune through Tattersall's as the general manager. And when he died, there were the 12 main beneficiaries, which, were people like his nephew. He didn't have children of his own, but he had nephews. He left it to solicitors and to various people, and it was to be left in trust, and the benefits to be inherited by the descendants of all the trustees. And it used to be very, very secret. And again, this would spark interest in it as what sort of secret organization is it, what are they involved in, that sort of thing. So when the company was floated, it was announced I think in 2005, and in 2006 it was floated on the stock market, and so of course there was no anonymity anymore for anyone, and it's a really good thing, and most people embraced it. Some people didn't like it. They didn't like people maybe knowing where their money came from or how wealthy they were, but that's what happens. And there was approximately 2,500 people getting money. Some of the individual people related to Lions Group and everything, some individual and a Playhouse, that family, had around 80 million each, and some 4.5 million. Quite a lot of money, and this is where Helen Harvey came into it. So her mother Hilza had married into the Harveys, and I think was, someone was the grandson of that original D.H. Harvey. And so she didn't need to work. Who knows how eccentric she was at 28 when she retired from working life, but she had money that she inherited every year, and it's, it allowed her to just be herself. But what really irks me is that on that side of the family there were even though so George Adams, he didn't have children of his own, but he had lots of nephews, and the Harveys, there were lots of brothers and sisters, there's cousins, there's layers and layers of Harvey family who should have been looking after Hilza. And I'm going to tell you what happened to her is, no one was really looking out for them. They were receiving money, but they didn't have support, and they were just free to live how they want. And Helen was supposedly her mother Hilza's carer. Okay, so they were living in squalor, as I said, and there was a large number of very neglected cats and dogs in this property. So Martin would help her with this, he would help her with the garden, but mostly they hung around together, and people used to talk about it, but I don't believe it was a sexual relationship. It was just meeting of two isolated people, disenfranchised people. In 1990, in June 1990, a concerned community member reported Helen to the health department authorities, and medics, when they went there, they discovered Hilza in this old chair in the kitchen, which would be where she would have spent all her time. She would have slept there. She wasn't being bathed. She wasn't receiving medical care. She had a hip that was broken 2 years prior, the approximate. Okay, and she had sores, open sores, and she had untreated ulcers. Now, ulcers with the best of care are really difficult to heal. Helen had ulcers that she wasn't healing. There is some degree of mental illness to neglect self as well as elderly mother, and especially when you've got the money to get better care. She could have had a nurse living there. I think people, when they're eccentric in certain ways, they just don't want people around because they boss them around. They tell them how to live, and they don't want that. But the suffering that, Hilza must have been in so much discomfort and pain. So, and Manuka honey, by the way, the really high, the powerful 80 plus Manuka honey, that's what will heal ulcers other than medicines. So, pharmaceuticals. What else did I write here? Yeah, so Hilza, she got taken away, but, it was too late, and she died a few weeks later, and she was only 72. Now, I'm not even sure of Helen's birth year, because Carleen, Martin's mother, says she was 52 when she met Martin. Other accounts say that she was 54, and actually I couldn't find her birth date. Need to look a bit harder, I guess. The RSPCA confiscated the poor beasts and placed a ban for animal ownership on that property. Maurice, ever sacrificing for Martin, took long service leave to carry out a 3-month cleanup of the mansion. It had to be in a dreadful state. In 1991, Martin left his parents' home in Newtown to live at a 72-acre farm Helen purchased in Copping. It was called Tourisville. If you are psychotic, you might think, oh, Tourisville, bullshit, Port Arthur is bullshit, right? Where they began to hoard animals again, okay, including pigs, miniature ponies, and, of course, dogs and probably cats. And it wasn't uncommon for Helen and Martin to be seen driving around town in one of the very, very many vehicles. They used to buy and discard vehicles. They did this 30 times over in about 3 years. They would drive around town or into town, and people would walk past the parked car, and there'd be a miniature pig or a pony in the back seat. Martin was still being regularly assessed for his disability pension, and it was around this time a note from an assessor stated, "Father protects him from any occasion which might upset him, as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to let Martin out of his parents' control." So in 1992, on the 20th of October, Helen Harvey was killed in an automobile accident. Now, this wasn't the first automobile accident that Helen and Martin had been in. One neighbour, I think Mr. Featherstone, he had gotten them out of a ditch in the past. That had at least 3 of these accidents, and the cause was that Martin Bryant would grab, lean across and grab at the steering wheel. And whether he thought this was a great lark, without understanding consequences or what, I don't know. Did he understand the consequences on the day that he swerved this vehicle into oncoming traffic? I don't know. Martin himself said, no, it wasn't. I didn't do that. The accident was caused by Helen being really distracted by the 3 dogs that we had with us. They were fighting in the back, and she was distracted. Now, yeah, that could happen, right? Except in Australia, we are in the right-hand side of our car, so our passenger's on the left, and we drive on the left-hand side. And when you turn around, you're more likely to veer into a ditch and not into oncoming traffic. But hey, I don't know. So passing motorists saw the crash site and they stopped. Helen was dead at the scene. Martin was hurt. He spent 7 months in hospital recuperating from neck and back injuries. One of the dogs was dead. One was near dead and did die, and another one was hurt but lived. And I don't think anyone in the the car that they had the accident into died. I'm sorry if I'm wrong about that. So Featherstone, who has, pulled Helen and Martin in their vehicle out of a ditch before, he is convinced that Martin caused that accident. Now, I just put a note here too. Personally, I think the death of Helen, Martin's only friend other than his father, was a catalyst for the spiral of Maurice's mental well-being, okay, because he must have been exhausted trying to keep Martin safe and the community safe from Martin. One day he'd been driving with Martin past a prison in Tasmania, not Risdon where he is now, a different one, and he pointed it out to Martin. He said, "Martin, don't you ever end up in there. Don't do anything that is going to make you end up in there, because Martin, I will never come to see you. You will never see me again. Okay? So don't do anything that would ever cause you to be there." It must have been on his mind. It had to have been. He's seriously worried. Yeah. In 1993, so June of 1993, Maurice, who'd taken over the care of, did I miss out a whole page? No, yeah. The farm, Touristville, it was in a place called Copping. So in June 1993, so 3 years before the event at Port Arthur, Maurice went to the doctor and was prescribed antidepressants. He was having to look after Copping Farm. He was trying to sell off the animals. He was trying to repair the house, etc. After Helen's death. Okay, and Martin received an inheritance from Helen. He received the farm. He received the home that they had lived in, which is where Hilda and Helen were living when Martin first met them. He inherited all sorts of things, right? So it was a lump sum of money, said to have been $647,000, and plus the properties. So Martin, he could withdraw a certain amount from the guardianship. Carlene put it into perpetuity. I can't say it, but she got an advisor, she got a money manager, she put it into trust, and this just released money to Martin, because otherwise he would just blow it all. And she wanted it, him safeguarded. So August the 14th, 1963, Morris arranged for a visitor to come to the farm. So it wasn't just out of the blue, someone who was calling around, a friend or anything. It was someone to come and talk about the rates or something like that, right? Morris made the appointment. When this person turned up, there was a note pinned to the door of the farmhouse. Call the police. And there was a search. He wasn't turned up at first, so they started checking the 4 waterways that were on the land, and in one of the dams, the body of Maurice was found. He had a dive belt around his neck, and he'd taken a lot of sedatives. This is really a big thing to the conspiracy theorists. They think that Martin murdered Helen for the money, taking the risk that he himself would survive, and they say that he murdered his father as well. Would Martin put a note on the door saying, call the police? No. And Martin's father had put his affairs in order. He had put in his will that Martin would get his superannuation of $250,000. He had changed the bank accounts of his marriage into only Carlene's name, same with the bills. He had, just put his affairs in order. He left some cash in his motor vehicle to be found, probably to pay for his funeral, He knew it was just only him. Helen was gone, Martin's sidekick sort of thing, right? And it was, all the weight was on Maurice, and I think he just couldn't see an end to it. And he sort of kind of released Martin into the world, didn't he, with his own death. And I think it really did affect Martin, because within the space of a year he lost his 2 only friends, because he wasn't friends with his mother. She has been supportive of him up until a point, even at one stage, saying that she thought he was not guilty. But I think, I wrote here, Maurice was filled with despair, knowing that Martin was likely to act out his loneliness. Between 1993 and 95, at this time, Martin started using his money to travel. He went domestically around Australia. He'd go to Sydney a lot, but he also travelled to international destinations. He sold the Copping Farm for $143,000. He moved back into the Clare Street townhouse in Newtown, and after his father's death, he began drinking heavily. Sweet, sickly drinks like Guinness, Sambuca Irish cream, port wine. He had drunk a little bit before, but not heavily. He became suicidal, and he had said, he's had enough. I've had enough. People are against me. And also people say that Dunblane was the catalyst. Dunblane was the Scottish massacre in March 1996, but I really think it was something he was thinking of since his father's death, maybe prior. He'd been buying weapons and huge amounts of ammunition 5 months prior, and Dunblane was just a month or 3 weeks sort of thing prior. Martin did have girlfriends, even though they didn't last, and in 1995 he was seeing a girl called Janetta Hoani, and she was daughter of one of his mother's friends at a church his mother would go to, and they got introduced that way. And at first she thought he was a bit dorky, but he actually started spending some of his money on clothes, trying to sort of develop a persona that way, and he started dressing a little bit more snappily. And so they went out for 8 months. He took her on trips to Sydney, etc. He bought a boat at one point, spent 9K on a boat, and he took Janetta out even though it was really rough conditions, and he had engine trouble out there, and she said he was really frightened. He didn't want to die out there, you know. So for someone suicidal, you know, you might think that's crazy, but why would he care? And he was in a wetsuit too. She wasn't, I think, and they were very cold. He was cold, and she was colder out there. They did get rescued by another person in another boat, but you know, luckily. But I think it's because that's not how he wanted to die. I think maybe even he already had some idea of this blaze of glory. You know, that is not unusual for suicidal young men. She also, she broke it off with him because he started weeding her out, and she thought he wasn't smart enough. And I believe this is documented, but I'll just say it was alleged, but I believe it was documented in that he brought pornographic images, including bestiality, in from Scandinavia on his travels, and he would show it to his young girlfriends, including Janetta. And he had a girlfriend at the time of the Port Arthur massacre. Her name was Petra Wilmot. They'd only been going out for a few weeks, but long enough that she would stay overnight with him at his house in Newtown. But on that Sunday, he had said, "Oh, you should just go home to your parents now because I've got stuff to do today. I've got something I have to do." But again, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the next video, because, you know, that's part of the conspiracy, isn't it, that Petra was his handler, and, you know, she was MK Ultraing him. Takes longer than the few weeks, and look, she's 20 years old at the time. Not saying that a 20-year-old can't be involved in some pretty shady stuff, but no, she's just a girl. She's just a girl that dated Martin because she liked his surfy image. From here, at this stage, he'd gone from, you know, the zoot suit styling with the lizard skin shoes to more surfy look. He was a poser. He had a surfboard, but he couldn't surf. He was scared of the waves, even though he was a diver, scuba diver. But you know, he'd buy his surf shop gear and dress in a particular way. He grew out his hair. It was very long, fluffy, blonde hair. And she did date him because he was kind to her. Again, she did note how weird he was, but yeah, they were current at the time of the massacre. So that's getting you up to date to the Port Arthur massacre, and we'll talk about that next time. We'll talk about conspiracy versus reality. All right, see you later.